Okay, welcome to a joint production, potentially. Hey, all right. UTOKing with Gregg, Integral Stage, and what I don't really give a crap because it's one of my favorite people, Layman Pascal.
Yeah, we're on both or neither platforms now. I'm here with Gregg, who I think is fantastic. And if I am to believe some graffiti I saw at a public restroom not far from Gregg's house, he's a guy who solved most of the world's problems. So I've come to the right place for some answers.
Fantastic. All right. That's right. That's graffiti. It's not just in Virginia. You'll see that graffiti periodically. You'll see little iQuad coins and whatnot in other places.
So I was thinking about this morning, I was trying to think what fundamentally is pathology.
Okay.
And then I was like, well, maybe like, oh, just etymologically on the face of it, it's supposed to be the study of pathos. I'm like, so what is that? I'm like, oh, it's things that make you go, oh, that's not right.
That's broken.
So that's not a terrible way to think about it, but we'd like to get more specific and more comprehensive and more usefully intelligible about this. And
totally.
I was thinking about the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which I think it proposes itself as a means to establish a common workable language for patients and scholars and therapists and neuroscientists.
Yep.
But it's gone through major revisions. It's
Huge.
arguably undermined by institutional groupthink, by social fads, by the economic interests of pharmaceutical corporations. Seems to me that it's derived, it's taken new insights and data and combined that with some original categories that emerged from the work of early 20th century analysts.
Yep.
And the data is often hard to reproduce. Sometimes it's dubious in the quality of its statistical analysis. And those original analysts significantly disagreed amongst each other about what they were talking about.
100%.
So we've got a prominent, somewhat useful tool that is likely to be inadequate to provide the source material for a broader, coherent, multi-approach description of the major types of phenomenon that a unified psychology has to address.
Totally.
So a better, more integrated view of the theory and practice of diagnostics would be great, and we can be thinking toward that today.
100%. So this is wonderful. And if there's anybody I want to talk about this with, Layman, with your unbelievably broad view and integrated potential and capacity to follow a multiplicity of things at once, which is necessary for this conversation, it's great to dialogue with you about this. So yeah, so let's just, so people are, I'm sure they're basically aware, but we should, there are a couple of key things to say about the DSM. It currently exists in its 5th edition. It stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's developed by the American Medical Association, and underneath of that, psychiatry. Okay, so folks need to be very aware. You mentioned the institutional dynamics. This is hugely important, and that is that medicine manages health. Okay, and why is that important is because medicine isn't really sure on what its core identity is. But if you think about medicine from a scientific perspective, which is definitely many people would, and its institutional identity, it very much potentially argues that it ties into biological phenomenon and the science of biology. Okay. And many people have argued, we get into this more, but it's like, well, medicine deals with broken biological things, malfunctioning biological things that cause difficulty. And then medicine develops its structure to try to do that. It's called the biomedical model. Okay, it's not the only model. There's another model. There are actually several, but the other prominent models, biopsychosocial model of health that informs medicine. So medicine itself has these different identities about, well, is its role to foster health overall, or is it specialty to foster broken biology? Because other, priests and counselors are not medical doctors, they deal with health. So there's really, and the reason I say this is because then how we think about psychopathology or the DSM and diagnosis, is this really the root cause has got to be broken biology if it's a biomedical frame that you bring to bear, or if you bring a biopsychosocial frame, then no, it wouldn't have to be tied to broken biology necessarily. And we never resolved this issue in terms of the basic nomenclature. So that's the DSM. The other thing to note is initially it's just a sort of description of psychoanalytic phenomena that isn't categorized really in the DSM-3 R in 1980, I think it is, really shifts fundamentally to try to bring behavioral science, reliability, validity, methodology, to the taxonomy of the structure. And I think that's generally a plus, but just a descriptive taxonomy with no etiology theory, meaning the underlying causal structures of what's going on. There is no, in fact, it's explicitly just a theoretical. Of course, that's a big debate. In fact, what I just said has at least assumptions that can be, that frame what kind of categories it is. So that's a long rambling dynamic. This is a long area of interest of mine, but those are just some reflections we can kind of get going on.
Yeah, so at best, and it's far from certain that it is at best, the DSM is a subcomponent of a general field of diagnostics.
Yep.
I like you bringing up the etiology because the structural dynamic is really interesting to me. I'm going in my mind to an anecdote of years ago. A friend of mine brought me a pamphlet. She thought she had self-diagnosed. She got this government counseling pamphlet. And so I looked through it. I'm like, oh my God, this is me. Right? But then I flip the page to the next one. I'm like, oh my God, this one is me. I start going through. I'm like, okay, I've got all of these diseases.
Yeah.
So that's improbable. I don't think I'm uniquely multi-psychiatrically deficient here. So the other option is that somehow being relatively sane is like an orchestration or a symphony of pathologies. And I'm like, so what does it mean if I'm thinking that? Well, I'm thinking a situation in which if one of the instruments in the band stands out, that's a problem. If it fits in, it's not a problem. So it's possible that there's a structural framework in which modules which exaggerated on their own form some kind of pathological function actually form a completely normal function when they're not exaggerated or deficient.
Totally.
So, and that clearly fits in with a guy who's thinking about integration surplus as a key to health and sanity. And also a guy who has no psychiatric diagnostic training whatsoever. So I'm curious from you what you think is like, how do you go at a structural and etiological model of pathology?
Right. So actually, this was my first theoretical paper. I actually did, I think it got published in 1999. And I got pulled into this when I was at working with the University of Pennsylvania under Aaron T. Beck, who actually just passed away this week. So I'm honored of that. And I had already built my model, the tree of knowledge system, and I was starting to then utilize that as a fundamental lens by which I would see reality in general, and in particular, differentiate. What it affords is the capacity to really differentiate essentially frequencies of behavior that are taking place at different levels of complexification, okay? So there was a big push in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology. There has been a theoretical concern within psychology about what is psychopathology, okay? And a man by the name of Jerome Wakefield advocated for what became a pretty prominent model called harmful dysfunction, okay? And essentially what it argued is that people have been debating a long time as, are these natural events, these diseases seem to be sort of natural in some categories, like you get a heart attack and die. Nobody wonders like, hey, is that just, fine? It's like, no, that was a real problem and I wish we could fix that, And then they're all, is high blood pressure a disease? That you really get into a lot of different issues, but he nailed, I think, and there's social construction issues versus biological issues. He sort of puts them together and says harmful, there clearly is a value-based judgment, like the system needs to decide individually, within a dyad, collectively, societally, that this is a harmful issue, okay? So there's clearly a value judgment. And then you decide that there is a dysfunction. Okay, relative to you need a natural concept of a natural function coupled to harm. What do we mean by natural function? Well, the part can be argued to be shaped by natural selection to serve as a pump so that they circulate the blood and then the nutrients and oxygen and everything. And if all of a sudden that functionality breaks so that the muscle gets tied up or there's a stroke and it can't do it, and then that ensues a dysfunction so that the coherent integrated structure at the level of biology then breaks down, cells stop dying, the whole intersection of systems then fails to perform the flow of energy, matter, information that affords that complexification. And it is also the case that that's associated with pain and other kinds of difficulties that we would under normal circumstances, it's a nightmare. You then have the harmful dysfunction analysis of what a disease is at its kind of core. Those then become the prototype or exemplary frameworks. And that applies to a lot of different issues. You can then, if you break your bone in your arm, your bone, why is the bone structured that way? And yep, that's both hurts really bad, and it's an injury that then left a malfunction in your bone. And yeah, those are things. So it's a pretty good categorization of mental, I should say, physical / really biological illness and disease. And then the argument was, we're going to use this to apply for what are real mental diseases. And certainly there are some categories of mental disease that fall under this pretty directly. And I don't think many people would dispute that something like Alzheimer's disease is a disease and a mental disease, okay? We watch somebody unable to remember, unable to organize their thoughts after they die. If we look at their brain, there's tangles and plaques in the hippocampus that's abnormal. That's a section of memory and cognition. There's lots of things that can potentially go on, but I'm just using an example. So there's a mental disease that's pretty clean and clear in relationship to on the continuity, okay? But then the question is that a good category framing for the domain of mental? And the tree of knowledge then immediately argues, if you look at its cones of matter, life, mind, culture, mind and culture are different cones of complexification than life is. And the argument that I gave is that some mental disorders are well understood as mental diseases because the primary sequelae do seem to fall from, or can be at least tied causally to, a malfunctioning biological structure, okay? We can hypothesize about that. But many of them are maladaptive patterns, okay? A maladaptive pattern is where the dysfunction occurs at the level of what I would call mental behavior, okay? So what's an example of that? Well, let's give a classic example that I gave is like around, say, depression and a vicious cycle of depression. Which in fact, I developed a whole model of depression called the behavioral shutdown model. It says depression should be thought of not as a disease or not disease, should just be described as a state of mental behavioral shutdown, okay? And what that would be is what's actually happening is the system can invest in and get return on its investment. It tries, it gets anxious and irritated and can't go. And so it just basically drops and elevates its negative affect system, pulls down its positive affect, and sort of gets into a sick mode, okay? Now, that makes perfect sense in many environments to be in that. Like if you're an abused spouse, or you get tossed in prison, or your child dies, there's lots of good reasons as to why you might find the system, its path of investment, unbelievably constrained, can't do anything, gets trapped, starts getting shut down, okay? And I would then consider that there'd be many instances where the depression is a normal, understandable reaction. At the same time, let's say you go off to college and you're hoping that everything's going to be fine. You're going to escape. You get there. You're kind of anxious. You get criticized a little bit. You feel awkward. You hide in your room. And then all of a sudden, everyone else starting to make connections. You feel worse. And that makes you feel like doing less and less. And now all of a sudden, you're in a cycle of shutting down and avoiding. And the way in which you then cope, although you feel better in the short term because you avoided something, now all of a sudden the long-term consequences are things are getting worse and worse, precisely because you're just engaged in a normal adaptive kind of response, but it traps you in a behavioral cycle. Addictions can be framed this way, or many of them can be framed. Lots of different patterns of relating that then trap people in far from optimal scenarios that then cause suffering. But there's no broken biology here. It's at the level of adaptive behavior patterns. So I argue that a huge chunk of certainly what people go for psychotherapy are really entrenched maladaptive patterns that are clinically significant, but there is no way to think about this usefully or fruitfully in terms of broken biology, malfunctioning biology.
That seems like it places a lot of responsibility on the analyst and the diagnostician relative to their perception of what a functioning society or functioning relationships are.
Totally.
Because if they're going to make a value judgment about maladaption, what are they adapting to, right? Yep. Is your society fucked up, or are you fucked up?
That's a great question. In fact, in 1968, Martin Luther King delivers a famous address to the American Psychological Association. And he says, you've given us a great word, maladjusted, maladapted, in some ways. But then he's like, to what things should we be maladjusted to? Okay. And then you have to have this framework with regards to, it certainly makes sense that we want to have, and what is health and what's optimal functioning. In fact, the seventh branch on the tree back there is the idea, is a framework for understanding what we mean by human well-being. Because I was also, this is one of the areas, it was like there's an enormous amount of complexity and confusion about what we mean by these central concepts. I'll give you another example about what makes this complicated. And basically the field punts on this issue. You're bringing up a central issue, which is like, really to make a judgment, we have a frame of what optimal functioning is, okay? My friend, Waldemar Schmidt, who is on the TOK Executive Society, he was trained as a pathophysiologist in, that's what is a professor of pathophysiology, but is always interested in human psychology. But he told me this story, which is really, goes right to your point, which is that when he was getting trained on the liver and the kidney and female reproductive systems, the first thing that he would learn was what is a functional kidney, liver, and female reproductive system. So that would become the template by which you then judge, oh, this is what a dysfunctional system looks like, because we have a reference for what a functional. You open up the DSM and the only judgment is never specified. It's just normative. It's a deviation from normal, essentially. And do you mean normative functioning? Do you mean like distributionally normative, statistically? What the hell do we mean by normal, typical, functional? There is no articulation in the context of psychiatry, really, about what normative functioning is. There's a psychodynamic diagnostic model, the psychodynamic, I think that's what it is, Psychodynamic Diagnostic Manual. And it actually is interesting because what it starts with is different descriptions of human functionality across emotion, relationship, identity, and says these are what kinds of, this kind of normal into high optimal functioning capacities for individuals. And then it's deviation from that we are going to then really diagnose as maladaptive psychodynamic process. So they at least do acknowledge and afford a particular picture of what, healthy psychodynamic functioning looks like. And I absolutely think that is central for us in the therapy room and for us societally to think about what's a healthy person look like and what's a healthy society. And when you have an unhealthy society and a person reacting to that, how do we make some decisions? Lots of people have talked about that, but there's virtually no institutional understanding, agreement, structure on it. It's a really, really central question.
All right, so we've got a sort of general sense of the UTOK framing of how we approach pathologies in general. Now I think it would be fun to dive into some specific ones. What am I thinking of here? Like, I love retro psychopathology, like anything from the 20s. It's clearly outdated, but it's also always like kind of fresh and provocative in some ways.
Yeah, sure.
And one of my favorites is Character Analysis by Wilhelm Reich.
Yeah, that is classic.
And he's first elaborating for other therapists the correlations between Freud's diagnostic categories and different styles of posture and facial tension, muscular rigidity, inhibited breathing, all that stuff. And he relates that to the idea that you can't possibly psychologically integrate material whose stimulation is being rejected by your physiological clampdown.
Totally.
But the model gets ambiguous, I find, when he describes schizoid and schizophrenic types. And his take on the schizoid, which also then shows up later in Alexander Lowen's bioenergetics and things like that, is the idea that the schizophrenic has a healthy ability to experience streaming and stimulation and connections and ideas, but they process it as if it's coming in from the outside. It's not perceived as subjective. So in some ways, they're healthier than the average person, but their processing is inverted. It comes at them rather than experienced as part of themselves. So that's one provocative, outdated take. What's a good UTOK understanding of the schizophrenic, Greg?
Well, this is okay. Right. Well, that's an easy question. Let me field that for you with a lot of. Schizophrenia is an unbelievably complicated, dynamic, and it is not an area of psychopathology that I've dove into enormously. The first thing that I will say is that at a taxonomy level, it is useful to divide schizophrenia up into two broad categories of positive and negative symptoms. Okay. Positive symptoms are excesses of things that are outside the norm. Okay. And then negative symptoms are restrictions of things that you expect to see in other people that are absent. All right. So two classic examples of positive symptoms are delusions and hallucinations. Okay. So a delusion is a very unusually likely to be true belief about the world in a particular way. And a hallucination then is the perceptual experience of something that nobody else from the outside, or if we were taking a video of something, okay? So for example, I treated a woman, just to give one example, I've treated a number of individuals with schizophrenia. She had a fairly unusual hallucination / delusion that she had been infected by bugs. They lived in her system. She had a haptic delusion that she could feel them crawling in. And then she also had a visual hallucination that occasionally they would come out of her and they would be flying around. She also would fear that they would get infected with other people, okay? In terms of the UTOK structure, what it would then say is, let's differentiate what delusions are from hallucinations in the different kind of cognitive processes that are operative. Delusions then can be found in the system of justification. So that's the propositional narrative meaning-making system, okay, versus a confusion in relationship to the perspectival system, mind 2 versus mind 3. And of course, it's not surprising that they would often go together. But what's actually, if we then think about, okay, well, what those are additions, I think that the early, character formulation idea that, yes, they misconstrued from coming to the outside, that's definitely a reasonable element. I think more modern things in terms of, say, like predictive processing, fundamentally are then looking for hypotheses to reduce surprise, and the ease with which they then generate a hypothesis, clamp down and project the frame to see the pattern in a particular way, and then somehow there's a feedback loop that prevents it from then being, normally you see something, maybe that's what it is. I mean, and I'm not talking necessarily about conscious hypothesis, but I'm talking about tracking the way in which you would build a model of something and track it. For some reason, it's very loose in making hypotheses and affording and being confirmed with very limited data, and then being held in perception as though it was conformed to that data. So there's a constant process oscillation. And so for me, I think that probably schizophrenia as a cluster is going to be a multitude of different breakdowns in particular kinds of processing. There are classic cases of schizophrenia, which would be somebody who's a little odd, okay? And then when they're in a young adult, place, out over a period of 6 months to a year, go from being odd, what we call schizotypal, into a full-blown schizophrenic episode, okay? Where all of a sudden they're putting, classically, aluminum foil hats on their head because they feel voices in their head that they then interpret as being beamed in from aliens. So they then put and then at that level, when you see a classic break in schizophrenia, my argument would be that the mind 2 consciousness system that affords a particular broadcast function for integration has gotten its thresholds or in wiring or whatever process. And other people would understand this a lot better than I do, but basically there are essentially likely malfunctions in the process by which it generates and holds on to hypotheses, and the ease with which then it generates justificatory narratives on top of those gets very, very loose and open, and then conclusive, and then freezes with those particular delusions on top of that. So that's sort of a brief description of a classic sort of schizophrenic picture. And I would generally consider a classic schizophrenic picture like that to be probably mental disease-like. And what I mean by that is that my understanding of the way humans generally adjust to the world can give rise to lots of different kinds of pathology, like borderline personality disorder, et cetera. But to watch somebody go from in a 6-month period to that kind of breakdown probably is going to involve some pretty significant neurobiological pathologies. Now, that's not to say that the soul psyche isn't playing a huge role in the way that gets organized and manifested, but that's probably not just stressors that's going to cause that kind of shift.
Yeah, it seems like we can look pretty obviously if there's accelerating change, this person's doing this more and more and it's interfering with their lives, that's kind of obvious. But this is also an area that really opens up ambiguous spaces between what's healthy and not healthy, right? I'm thinking of the, bugs on your skin. A lot of people take drugs and they have that same experience because I think we do see visual specks. We do feel weird itches on our skin. And we probably have a constantly operating interpretive system that says, be aware that creeping things could unexpectedly be on you.
Totally.
So that's a valid interpretation, but it's getting exaggerated. And then we look at the exaggeration, but we often don't look at the opponent processing, which is what's missing that normally keeps those exaggerations in check. That's intriguing and kind of makes it ambiguous what's healthy or not healthy. I'm thinking about what you said earlier about considering the function, like the heart. And it's very obvious somebody has a heart attack, but we also seemingly have to be pretty fluid and open going forward, because somebody will come along and say, you know what, your heart actually can't pump all that blood. Diaphragm and your movement's doing it. What your heart actually does is generate a torus-shaped electromagnetic field around your body. Like, okay, so we've got to be loose about what the function is.
Totally.
And this is where, okay, I'm going to make a slight deviation from what's comfortable to a lot of psychologists, because I'm thinking of my mother.
Okay.
And she would tell me stories that the older women in her family in the 50s would be like, if you told a psychiatrist that you would be lobotomized or get electroshock, and years ago you would have been burned. And like about voices and intuitions and structures that she would see. And I would joke to her that, if she revealed her actual inner life to a state-sanctioned diagnostician, then that fact alone is proof of mental illness.
Right.
But, joking aside, how does the diagnosis of pathology make room for possibilities of positive engagement with subtle, imaginal, or even properly spiritual phenomenon that might be ambiguous and troubling and undigested, but normal and healthy?
Totally. And this is where you need, in my estimation, you need a particular, effective model mapping of psyche, or whatever frame we would give. So for me, one way of thinking about psyche is to think about sort of the neuropsychological, sort of imaginal, informational, semantic structure that processes and coordinates the system. I place it in a vertical structure of the lowest layers is the body. And John Vervaeke and I talk about, pleasure, pain, and tracking, fight, flight, and all of that. Then you move up into the heart, and then the heart, is sort of the relational attachment system. I track that with the influence matrix. Then you imagine stuff through sort of deliberative, say, right brain processes, and justify shit through left brain processes. And then you're aligned with larger tasks, and then you're in relationship to other people, and also then in relationship to past. So you have to have this sort of this distant past, horizontal, vertical kind of relation. All right. And for me, then, if we can map these kinds of issues, then we can basically say, and I would argue that biology does this with all the systems that we have, sort of like, what is the heart doing relative to the kidneys? What kind of communication are they engaged in? How's the digestive tracking working? And at the organismic level, there's all the system interface. We can certainly look at an isolated system and then wonder, but we also need to put it in context. We need to nest it in particular context. So if we have a particular structural sense of way to track, say, the bottom layer of the psyche, whatever, understand its developmental history, understand how that gets, juxtaposed in with your heart, with your image, with your narrator in the relational world. If we have a model of, what is a coherent, integrated, pluralistic sense of the vertical integration, and how do we actually shine a light on things and then relate to them? So I'll give an example personally. Okay. So I have a unusual obsession, although it hasn't been activated for a while, but it got activated. The unusual obsession was when I was going around to my friends' weddings. They'll probably love to hear about this. When I was, when my friends were getting married, okay, and when I was at a wedding, I would get an obsession, and by obsession simply means an intrusive thought that you're not really related to your ego. It's like, where the fuck did that come from? And it would be when the bride was walking her way down, here comes the bride, that I would bounce out of my chair and linebacker tackle her. Okay, that was the very, very strong image and some impulse, although I never really was worried that I was actually going to do it. But for a while, every wedding I would go, and the less I knew the person, the more strong the image was. Okay. And basically, and what I tell people is that if my justification area was like, oh my God, I'm a fucking freak, it's like, this is really my true self. This is really what I want to do, blah, blah, blah. But what I saw it as is, yes, I think there is something about me that is sort of anti-authoritarian, trying to flick off the culture occasionally. You know, I have a particular structure. The raw randomness of human behavior relative to, as I try to analyze it, the part of my heart that just wants to see it chaotic, that you never predict, that some totally normal professor guy would hop out of and just linebacker tackle a bride that he didn't know for no reason other than to say, predict that. Is a so, but to me, the issue is like, hey, what does that actually mean? And then what's the healthy holding environment for that kind of thing? I don't know that we have, I have my own notions, and UTOK gives a particular notion. And I can tell you about kind of what the holding environment for coherent integration is, and what I then see as maladaptive kind of issues in the short and long term, how they get entrenched, and then what is malfunctioning related issues. So for me, that's basically just a signal from my unconscious, but I then afford the opportunity to narrate. Obviously, if I literally ever did that, if I ever released that, the consequences would be really serious, and there'd be a lot of maladaptive shit to deal with. But I that could have become an obsession that was actually a disorder. But the way I related to it, and I share this with my students, is like the way I related to it makes it very different. So there's definitely the thing, there's how it's metabolized, how you justify it, and how you relate to it. And this is a very, very complicated network of considerations.
Yeah, the ideation is one thing, and the value, the perverse aesthetic pleasure of it is something else, and then the holding environment is the third thing. I mean, I think of, when I was a kid, there was always this discussion about people saying, well, the devil told me to kill those people or something like that, right? And there's always the question like, yeah, but why did you do it? Like, that's a different question. Why did you just do something a voice tells you to? That's a bit weird. That's another issue,
right?
But here's what's another? Okay, this morning, this actually happened. I was out to get some cheese by my favorite Quebecois cheesemaker. They didn't have any, so I'm driving home this morning, and I'm trying to feel what's important to me about pathology and diagnostics, because I'm going to talk to Gregg, and my own thoughts burst in, and it's like, hey, Layman. I'm like, yeah. Like, that song about the guy who kills the sheriff, but not the deputy? I'm like, yeah. And it's like, well, there's a good chance that guy was trying to mitigate responsibility for double homicide, so he wasn't telling the truth. But what if he was? I'm like, okay, I'm listening. If he was telling the truth, then there needs to be another song about the man or woman who killed the deputy, but not the sheriff. I'm like, okay. And it's like, and if no one's going to write that song, then maybe you have to. I'm like, oh my God. Right. But there's a slippery grandiosity to that. Like, maybe only I can be called forth to do this thing that no one else can even see the need for.
Totally.
So let's talk a little bit about megalomania, grandiose ideation, psychic inflation, which is something that can happen for no good reason, but also something that can happen for great reasons, like you're a genius or your kundalini fluxed into your cranium or something like that. So what is how does megalopsychia stand? When is it of diagnostic significance, and when is it a reasonable thing?
Right. Well, that's another great question. So let's talk a little bit about at least two immediate issues that come to mind in regards to this. So one is bipolar disorder. Okay. And then the emergence of mania. So let's talk a little bit about what that is. So in terms of your animal experiential system, you basically have a gas pedal and a brake pedal. Gas pedal is positive emotion, energy, desire, acquire. The other is brake, avoid, negative affect, because it's threat-based, okay? And this basically is in what I call the experiential system. Animal embeddedness gets into, fight, flight, appetites, things along those lines.
Are those, sort of interrupt you there, are you thinking of those as very closely tied to parasympathetic and sympathetic, or as distinct from that?
Well, that you can basically do it this way. You can do, it's a 2x2, okay? So there's approach, pleasure, avoid pain, active, passive, okay? Arousal and shutdown. So most of the parasympathetic, sympathetic is an arousal, active, passive regulator, okay? And then it's an active, passive regulator on a desire active, because you get all jacked up on the active side. You could either be, oh my God, I'm super excited, or oh my God, I'm terrified, okay? So those are both active. And then the shutdowns is, hey, you're really relaxed. You got what you wanted. So thank God, goal, activation, accomplishment, go smoke a cig, you just got laid or whatever, okay? Or shutdown, defeat. So you actually create a 2x2, which gives a very good model. It's a circumplex model of affect motivation. All right. And then basically you do 2 by 2, approach, avoid, active, passive. You do active approach, that's desire. Okay. Active avoid, that's fear, anxiety. All right. When you talk about fear and anxiety, there's slightly different concepts. We'll just yoke them together for now. Then you go down and you go active, active avoid is here. And then that's active. No, passive. That's why I got screwed up. Sorry. So passive pain is depression. Okay. Loss, sadness. You can't do anything, so you shut down. Okay. And then passive good or approach is relaxation, contentment. All right. And then you can see they're opposites. So fear and contentment are opposites. Okay. Desire and depression are basically opposites. All right. And that gives you, and so that's kind of the energizing motion, emotional structure, 2 by 2 structure that the body, in terms of its complex adaptive energy dispersal, is organized around. All right. So now I started on this because of the whole bipolar dynamic. All right. So in classic bipolar 1, essentially what you have is normally when you get active, you see something, you expend your energy, you work hard, you get your goal, and then you drop into passive because it's a constant dialectic, okay, between expend and then come back because you need that dialectic. Well, with bipolar, essentially, and actually epileptic drugs actually some epileptic drugs treat bipolar, it's an epileptic positive feedback loop on the desire, at least classically, meaning you get something, and goals will trigger manic episodes. You get something and then you want to do something else, okay? Rather than come back to baseline, it's like, oh my God, I want to do more of this. I get this and I get this, and then all of a sudden the desire possibility of what you can accomplish expands way beyond, and you can track this in a level. It's called hypomania, mania phase 1, mania phase 2, and then mania phase 3, which basically then back into a crash, okay? So when you're hypomanic, you contrast your past capacities, and you have all this energy and all this seeming ability to acquire goals and resources. You jump up a notch in terms of your sense of importance and your capacity. When you tip into mania, phase 1, then this felt sense kind of loses potentially some of its grounding and feedback. So you really just basically start to see yourself as capable of doing almost anything. And your risk analysis goes way down, and you're basically feeling kind of like Superman, in gambling and sex and spending money. There are no consequences that you can't manage. And it's because you have this unbelievable energy for desire acquisition. And then in mania phase 2, you get delusions about just, it turns out I'm Jesus Christ. I'm the next incarnation, or I'm Superman, or I've been chosen, or I have this unbelievable superpowers. And then you behave very dysfunctionally. Shit hits the fan and people are like, oh my God, you're crazy. And then they lock you up or you get all depressed. But you can see from that energy level, you can see this whole like, I'm just super energized. I can acquire stuff. I have this felt sense that I have all these powers. It's the opposite of neuroticism in some ways. So there's that. The other dynamic that you can clearly see is sort of a relationship between what I call the blue line on the influence matrix. Now we move up into the heart. The heart seeks relational value and social influence, and it can try to do that vertically. It can compete with others, either directly or indirectly, see themselves above them. It can connect horizontally like love and then defend against that oppositely in hostility. And then it regulates its degree of involvement on what's called the green line, or autonomy, freedom line, dependency. So this blue line is an architecture of rankism, essentially. It's the way we tend to see ourselves in relationship to others on skill capacities intuitively. So are we above others? Okay. And then not infrequently, and especially perhaps in this culture, in fact, I would argue that oral indigenous cultures really work to regulate blue line dynamics, but our culture works to exacerbate it. Essentially, then it's the justification system in most instances wants to justify it as being as good as possible that the data afford, okay, on these kinds of issues. So most people think they're above average, okay. But the structure by which that thing can then turn into an egoic justifier, and then basically then turn into narcissism. So narcissism is the fundamental architecture where the ego sees itself on the blue line. And I would argue that our former president, in the United States, former President Trump, was a classic processor in this way. I called it the Trump algorithm, which is, I'm better than you. If you love me for that, I love you back. Okay. If you challenge that, I'll show you why you're wrong. And if you criticize me for that, I will punch you in the face. Okay. So everything, the Trump algorithm is I win, you love me. I win, you love me. That's the entire structure of justificatory behavior is fundamentally funneled through that structure. So that's an example then of really sort of attachment and identity driving this sort of sense of grandiosity. And so you like, hey, look at my car, it's a Corvette. Did I tell you I went to Yale? Just a constant flood. And they're pretty unempathetic individuals. We can talk about other ways, and this can go into like sociopaths that are slightly different or other kinds of dynamics, but really the mania and the narcissism are sort of two main sources for this megalomania, grandiosity, I'm on top of the world, no matter what you say kind of dynamic.
So there's a region, there's some kind of expansion that might be good for people as long as it's still coupled with reasonably accurate calculations and relational capacities. And
Totally.
There's kind of two ways to go beyond that. And one is a self-reinforcing cascade, and the other one is an interpretive lock-in of some kind. Okay. What else? I'm trying to remember. Like, what are the other ones? In those old books, what do they say are the pathologies? Oh, here's one. Okay, here's some gossip about psychotics I heard from a Lacanian.
Okay.
I heard that the psychotic has improperly installed the name of the father, which is to say the symbolic function associated with authority or the cultural potency to which the mother turns away from the child. And so lacking security in that primary signifier of the world map, the psychotic experiences the world as semantically unstable. So he or she, as a result, is always kind of self-medicating by imagining shadowy forces or some obscene controller who's willing to go all the way to establish coherent control over the world system because that's what they need. And these fantasies, conspicuously display the caricature of a eternal agency and the unreliable of the social habits that are structuring the world, and this desire to like go rogue and explode and call out the system as either unstable and dysfunctional or about to be organized by some obscene force. Is that just Lacanian crazy talk? Or is that part of what you understand psychosis to be as part of a coherent multidisciplinary psychology?
If you just reduced it to say that, oh, we know that that's the answer, it's Lacanian crazy talk. Okay. So to me, the basic issue is the deep problem with psychoanalytic structure is that they way overshot on unconscious predetermined psychic determinism, okay, where that all the symptoms then would be then interpreted through a particular lens, so that even things like morning sickness in women were then interpreted as aggression to barf up your baby because you're sucking your energy away in a particular way. I mean, that's pretty insane. So that is the structure. I basically argue this. So Freud looks at the justifying system, the egoic justifying system, and then actually he totally sees what I would call the subconscious attachment heart system brilliantly. And indeed, if he had stayed there, we would have stayed inside of science, okay? And indeed, the entire influence matrix, attachment, and what I would call psychodynamics stayed pretty close. Like, for example, that Trump is compensating the way his father judged him and puts himself up to compensate for underlying anxieties, and he has power needs and power dynamics to manipulate people. Even if his justification says, I just love everybody, we can see that no, scientifically, that's not the case, okay? I mean, we can see that underneath there are these subconscious dynamics in his need for relational value, social influence, the way he manages power, love, and freedom, that regardless of how he justifies, I can totally map the functionality of attachment. Okay. What Freud did is that he went from the subconscious level 1 analysis into the deep unconscious, what I would call level 2. Okay. And essentially he's trying to get into the body. He sees life and death, then sex and aggression. Okay. Which is really cool and important. But his flashlight for understanding those dynamics, well, unbelievably romantic and artistic and fascinating and interesting and partially true. There's a definite partial truth. But then to say scientifically, we know that that is what a psychotic, psychotic is an unbelievably broad category, okay, of a wide variety of different things, like I do acid and I feel kind of psychotic. Why? Was that back because I have father issues? I was like, no. I mean, but the way I manifest my acid trip is undoubtedly going to be having to do with my father issues. Okay. So as these images and fluctuations emerge, the fundamental conflicts in regulatory structures at the perspectival, what I call mind to conscious level, and justificatory mind are structured for equilibrium, and they defend against certain things. And absolutely the way that the flux happens, the symbolism is definitely shaped by that organization, even if there's a lot, let's say, going on at the neurobiological level. So we absolutely, in my estimation, many psychotic episodes have to be understood by essentially psychodynamic and maybe even psychoanalytic symbolism and wrestling. Okay. And it's useful to pay attention to that often for the client, just for sense making. To interpret that we can now say with any degree of assertion other than just a convenient fiction that that's the dynamic that drives this, that's where my scientific side said, no way, you don't have the epistemological validity and all the variables that you're talking about to say that with any kind of like scientific confidence at all. So that's where I would, kind of interpret that.
Yeah, that's great. I want to go on to psychopathy, but I've got a question that's coming up for me, which is, a lot of our structural weaknesses and or shadow material seem to get provoked by interpersonal engagements.
Sure.
Right. And we're lucky if that tends to only happen with your intimate partner in a private space, and you're not so lucky if it spills over into public space.
Totally.
But in a UTOK framing, are personal and impersonal simply two domains in which our shit gets brought up, or are those two distinct types of shit? Like, are there different problems interpersonally, or is interpersonal just another place where your problems emerge?
No, there's definitely different domains of problems. Okay. So for example, many cases, I would argue, of obsessive compulsive disorder. All right. Like that would be a classic example, would be a germ phobia, fear of dirt or whatever. You then constantly are washing your hands. Okay. I would see that coming out of basically the animal structure of these are little safety mechanisms that we have available to maintain territory, maintain cleanliness, and then they just basically glitch. Okay. To make an interpretation that that's an interpersonal phenomenon about control and about other kinds of things, possible, but there's no reason to say that isn't just if you're freezing cold, you're just cold. The body's cold. It's not like, oh, my cold mother is really the source of this. No, you're freezing cold. If your system wants to get clean or has then glitching about safety checking kinds of issues, that's can be very impersonal. Okay. So I certainly don't think everything should go into relational dynamics. That said, then you have this whole heart system. In the vast majority, what drive people into psychotherapy and nowadays, in my estimation, are internalizing conditions that can be understood as what I call triple negative neurotic loops. Okay, a triple negative neurotic loop is negative events that happen. They get triggered by negative feelings. Then the ego gets involved and then starts justifying, hey, those feelings themselves are bad. Whoever caused them to be bad, and you get into a blame self, blame other battle. Okay, around an attachment system that doesn't feel known and valued and secure, and is trying to defend against that and regulate that. But the processes by which then it does that, it traps the self in unproductive ways of relating to self, relating to others, relating to the world. And a lot of that then is driven by the self-other relational representations, the internal working models that we carry with us. Okay. The last UTOK dissertation that I supervised was on borderline personality disorder. Might have mentioned this in other contexts, but basically it was like, hey, how do we understand this fundamental structure? And the argument is that, well, people are born with high-level trait neuroticism. Okay, so that's not born with, but they're dispositionally predisposed to that. They get into a family structure where there's a lot of character, armor, defense, a lot of difficulty validating, a lot of difficulty processing, and creating an optimal holding environment. This person comes in with a high vulnerability. So they're strong emotions, powerhouse the system, and then everybody blames and defends, and there's no capacity to metabolize that. And then that creates an identity as they shift in adolescence as a broken, fragmented identity with really strong needs for power and submission, love and hate, freedom and dependency, and a fundamental felt sense that you're about ready to fall into the abandonment pit. So you're constantly defending against it. Huge amounts of psychopathology that we see that are these maladaptive, cyclical, vicious relational psychodynamics at the level of affect, heart, justification, trauma history, and then brought into the current structure. That's probably basically the 80%, 70% of walk-in outpatient psychotherapy can be kind of framed in that kind of context. I don't know if that answered your question, but that,
well, it makes me think about the borderline condition, because I think that's one of the most, I mean, people report it as one of the most problematic conditions, but also to the layperson's ear, they're not really sure what's being discussed. It sounds like it's between two other conditions, or maybe that's just my adjacency thinking.
No, actually, it's a very complicated word with a particular history. You're absolutely right to bring your adjacency. Why else would you have that term? It's a borderline in between shit. The actual history of the term is a psychodynamic, like most of our psychopathology language. And actually, these first category of big picture category, which I wish we would bring back, because I think it's a valid category. It actually speaks to some of the things we've been talking about, was the distinction between psychosis on the one hand, the large class of psychotic problems, which is technically defined as a genuine break from reality. So a psychotic condition is when the person is responding to reality in some way that is non-normative, out of touch with the convention of reality, and definitely atypical across a wide variety of different domains. So that was psychotic. Then you had neurotic. Neurotic were individuals that were suffering, but their contact with reality was not dissimilar, but they was just dominated by insecurities, negative affect, sensitivities to relational dynamics, etc. Okay. And then when the psychoanalytics started, they started to do psychoanalysis with the neurotics. Okay. And you get on there, and if you know original psychoanalysis, it's actually the whole idea is you actually are pretty withholding, you just interpret. Okay, it's pretty high level ego demands, really. You want to go in there, you're really vulnerable, you start spilling your guts, and the analyst basically just occasionally reflects an interpretive thing back to you. And you then have, and the whole idea was that then the withholding analyst then brings forth the underlying urges, childlike, etc., that gets, in the first 5 years of development, and then you project that onto the analyst, and then, then you gain insight, and then you could see what you do to project, and then where it was, let ego be, and then you now have a capacity to at least shine a light of understanding, and then apparently we're all fucked anyway from a psychoanalytic perspective, but at least fucked with insight is better than fucked with not insight, and so that's the structure. But to get to the point, then what you had was a subset of individuals that come in looking kind of neurotic, okay? You get them on the couch and they would decompensate instantaneously into almost a quasi-psychotic state. They would rage at they'd be completely so dysregulated very quickly that you would never want to treat them. So you would see them as basically neurotic, put them in an analytic context, and they would go quasi-psychotic. So they lived in the borderline space between neurotic and psychotic. And then you were not want to treat those individuals with psychological.
You're dealing with this person who, from an early age, exhibits high neurotic tendencies, and they're in an environment that exacerbates rather than salves that, to the point where they form an identity around that, and that identity is regularly or easily susceptible to moving into a quasi-psychosis.
Totally. Where the strong projections of the internal working models of the past onto the system create very extreme emotional, unregulated, erratic responses that are quite dysfunctional and sort of difficult to make sense out of and feel very weird from the outside perspective. Exactly.
Okay. I'm not usually impressed by people who want to explain to me the difference between psychopaths and sociopaths, but I do think it's interesting to make a distinction between people who are underdeveloped in their ethical and interpersonal intelligences versus a person who might be genetically or neurologically predisposed to have no conscience or be relatively indifferent to ethical intercoordination between people. I grew up on the West Coast in BC, so I paid a lot of attention to Dr. Robert Hare.
Of course.
And never was happy with his assessment tools, which seemed clunky and dismissive. So I'm much happier today with a richer notion of the antisocial spectrum and the possibility of the pro-social psychopath harnessed by a loving, rewarding social environment. The argument that some people might even do better if they scored slightly higher on a sociopathy scale, that maybe we inherit genes for hunting and war, where we're a little bit indifferent to village life and more relaxed in violent conditions. So I like the complexity of all that and the way it problematizes the condition. At the same time, there's a great book called The Wisdom of Psychopaths. And at the end, the guy goes in for intracranial electromagnetic destimulation of parts of the brain that are underperforming seemingly in the sociopath. And he is basically sociopathic for a period of hours afterwards. So it's not hard to argue that the condition is pathological. It's an inadequate neurophysiological, neuropsychological activity in certain areas. So I mean, that's a pretty broad spray over the topic. What's your take on the antisocial personality disorder, Greg?
Right. So I definitely want to differentiate antisocial personality disorders from psychopaths. Some people want to differentiate psychopaths from sociopaths and antisocials. I use psychopaths and sociopaths interchangeably. We can talk about what, I've seen a couple of differentiations I've not been super thrilled with. Okay. But here's the UTOK vantage point. Let's do antisocial first. Okay. An antisocial personality, is basically, it's a shift, a combination of a couple of things. So at the heart level, it's basically evolves in the influence matrix. You have the quadrants of upper right, which is, hey, you're secure, you're bounded by power, love, and a balance of autonomy and dependency. Lower left, that's abandoned, injured, low social influence, low relational value. Around that is a shame, submission kind of dimension, like I am pathetic. And then a hostile, angry towards other, hate, contempt of other. You made me this way. You're and then usually either a hyper-dependent or counter-dependent strategy, whereby dysfunctional attachment actually is erratic between hyper-dependent and the disorganized attachment and counter-dependent. Okay, so what do we see with antisocials? Basically, we see people getting channeled into what's called the self quadrant, all right, of strategy, whereby it's a very competitive dog-eat-dog world out there. People will undermine you. If you try to play the game of socialization, you will be taken. And so you take an anti-socialization attitude, like I'm not going to cooperate. I see, and I work with a lot of people, like when I was at the University of Pennsylvania in inner city Philadelphia, quasi-gang scenarios, lots of just really think about it as anti-socialization, dog-eat-dog, very competitive, usually low conscientiousness, okay, pretty impulsive, a very quick need to defend one's honor, a distrust of society in general. So I'm not going to value what other people need. If I can take something, fuck it, I'll take something. What's the point? So you get a justification and an attitude.
Does that person have some options, has some freedom to take that interpretation or another one? Or is that interpretation that sort of necessary description of something that's already going on inside them?
I think I think that you can think about this in terms, there's some flexibility here, especially if individuals in the antisocial potentially in different contexts. A lot of this then is the socialization process into anti-socialization. So at the level of, the architecture in a different system could well have cultivated. I think the heart architecture of an antisocial basically is primarily socialized, developmental, experiential. Not to say there's no genetic tendencies towards, say, disagreeableness and low conscientiousness that will prime that. But choice, at least at the level of, obviously, there's very limited choice, like, okay, I'm going to get up. Like I say, tomorrow, can I get up and become an axe murderer? No, actually, I don't think I actually have that choice. Maybe I'll tackle a bride. We'll see, but so like, can you wake up one day and basically, oh, well, I don't want to do this. You have to have lots of things that would afford that transformation. But the antisocial, as far as I'm concerned, does essentially get socialized quasi into that position. The difference with the socio/psychopath is on what's called the red line of affiliation. So the red line in the heart structure, the way affiliation works, if you look at like the neurobiology of altruism, okay, in sort of is the affiliation basically means to join with other, okay, to share fundamental interests with other. So we go around and we attach, we see the other as very different or very similar to ourselves, and then as we get affiliated with it, we see their interests as our interests, okay? So for example, if I'm a loving father, my kids are sick, I feel sick when they feel sick. My system actually will literally blur the representation of myself and the loved one and basically create static, so their pain is my pain, and you internalize that. Most individuals, in fact, humans, I really want to emphasize, most individuals have this deep capacity, Okay. When I was 6, I'm definitely very much not a sociopath. So I'm 6. I saw some of the advertisements for suffering kids in Africa. I went up, my parents weren't around. I went up, grabbed my piggy bank and said, Dad, mail this off to Africa, and I basically would say that my capacity to feel their suffering and then I have so much. And I didn't really get socialized in that. I didn't do that because my dad would then say, I'm so proud of you. At least I really don't think so. It's just, I could see their pain. I feel their pain. And then am I really just motivated to remove my own pain? That's a whole nother issue. But I'm pro-social in the sense that I internalize their interest. And that's what's fundamentally different with the socio-psychopath. Okay. The capacity then, indeed, why you can then scramble it with the brain is basically like, no, I'm cold to the other person's pain. It's a very different thing. I can see that they're in pain and cognitively even describe that pain, but the pull to that pain is my pain. And now I want to do something about it is totally gone. Okay. And then functional psychopaths can then just get around with contingency. It's like, well, okay, I don't really care, but hey, I get more shit if I treat other people nice, so I will do that. And that's what you get socialized based on contingency. Unfortunately, a number of people have this not only genetically, I think you're predisposed, but then if you're traumatized in a particular way, then you dissociate from that, then you resent the indignant, dehumanizing, whatever the abuse was, and then you flip it around and say, well, actually, I enjoy power over people. So then if you get a power hungry sociopath, those are the most dangerous characters, because then basically what they just find pleasurably and hedonistically enjoyable is to take somebody, drop them in, and just watch them in whatever torturous situation you might imagine, and be like, oh, isn't that fun? And those are the criminal mind characters that are, particularly egregious.
As long as we're in that dark territory, there's a theory. I think I first read it in a book called My Life Among the Serial Killers by the major and kind of the only female researcher in the field during the 80s and 90s. This idea that serial killers are not necessarily all sociopaths, just as not all sociopaths are serial killers, that there's a specific, unique pathology, a set of symptoms, an escalation pattern. I've joked that it's limbic fusion, by which I mean to imply that attack, eat, fuck, kill, run away are not well differentiated. If one fires, they all fire, leading to some catastrophic activities that the word evil is legitimately used to describe. What's your sense of the serial killer? Is it a pathology? Is it a subset of something else? How do the UTOK gods marshal their armada of diagnostics toward this?
Right. I've seen that, and I don't have enough refined knowledge to decide whether I'd make, but what you said is very consistent with the UTOK frame. So the sociopath, and somebody like Ted Bundy, classic, I would argue, basically a sociopath. So he's playing the fucking game, okay, with other people, all right, and never really has the capacity to empathize other than just play a game, try to elevate, gain control, has enormous amounts of rage, enjoys the process of killing, but doesn't, and is just the kind of a structural person that's not attached to that feeling at all. And my guess is really didn't feel any guilt or whatever. He's just playing a fucking game. So he's dispositionally detached from the interests and pains of others and enjoys fucking around with people at a power level and just a totally self-centered way. So that would be the sociopath. But then you have other individuals who would basically, you could certainly argue, you get the energy kind of structure of what you were saying in the animal body in relationship to that. And then the phase structure around like the urge to be a predator and to kill and to have this whole kind of complex of predation in relationship to that would be a very different architecture. So then now all of a sudden you basically are, remember, we are predators, right? And the idea that you have an urge to be a predator in a particular way from sort of the animalistic structure, and that basically that urge can't get integrated with the normal heart function, but then you get these unbelievable urges and you release them in a particular context. You actually go home and you do care about other people. You try to repress what the hell you did, but it's a compartmentalized, embodied urge structure that would be then different than the standard everyday sociopath who wouldn't care about anybody. So that would be one way in which you'd have the compartmentalized predators versus a sociopath would not be inconsistent at all with a UTOK kind of structure.
When we colloquially say that someone's hysterical, we tend to mean they're having manic fits of laughter or worry or insistence that are coming too quickly or too frantically for interpersonal sense making. Etymologically, this term is related to hysterectomies,
Yep.
right? Which means a lot of people have either assumed that we're either dealing with displaced reproductive excitements,
Yep.
or that maybe this is a false category deployed to demonize normal female arousal and angst.
Yep. It's floating uterus, I think, is the original etymological term.
One of the most fascinating things I've heard is this idea that hysterics they're not always having hysterical fits, but they're always promising it and probing people, that they kind of use seductive innuendo and threats and the possibility of going out of control as a way to provoke other people to see what's inside other people, because they don't trust that they think there is possibly a threat hidden within the other. What's your say? What's a hysteric?
Right. Well, there's why don't we just do DSM, and then we can go back and decide whether or not we also want to apply it to like what Freud saw in some of the hysterics. So, and from a UTOK perspective, they're histrionic personality disorder. Okay. If you look at the personality disorders through the UTOK perspective, essentially what I do is I basically say, okay, I apply the, most of this is identity, emotion, and relation. And then we can see the trends in many personality disorders through the influence matrix, okay? And what that basically means is that personality disorders are going to find themselves sort of having character armor relation in a felt sense of low relational value, low social influence, deep-seated issues around attachment originally, okay? And then some of the early psychodynamic, Karen Horney, this creates a fundamental basic anxiety. And then there are particular kinds of identity relational strategies, at least in the typical prototypes, that people get channeled into as a function of trying to navigate this, defense. And then you get rigid interpersonal strategies. So we talked about a narcissist. So the narcissist compensates in this way and develops a hyper high blue line structure and says, oh my God, I'm so perfect. And Trump's an example of that. If we flip down, avoidant personality is essentially the polar opposite of that, which basically defaults to, I'm going to submit, I'm completely inferior, I have no capacity, and I will then run away from any kind of thing because I'm such a loser. So this is the default loser strategy versus default winner strategy. We talked about antisocial, okay? So antisocial is like, fuck you, I'm not going to rely on you at all. I have no real need, sense that you will take care of me. So I'm going to get sort of counter-dependent, hostile, competitive, dog eat dog, okay? Then you get the opposite of that as well, dependent personality. Oh my God, at least I'll identify one or a group of individuals I totally need to take care of. I'll subjugate my needs for them and have them, okay? Another strategy is the high green line strategy of not counter-dependence, like I'm going to compete with you, but counter-dependence, I'm going to completely distance myself from you. So I'm not going to care at all about you. The root, I would argue, of core schizoid personality is a complete attachment detachment. Like, I don't understand why anybody has any intimacy at all. So they fundamentally, and this is just a negative absence of need. Now, whether that's compensatory or genetic or both, etc. But it's just like, I don't care what other people think. I live by myself and I do and I met a few schizoids. They would almost never come into psychotherapy on their own. I met some in prison, etc. They just feel completely no need for any human contact. Now, what's the opposite of that? Histrionic, okay? So the histrionic personality constantly needs to be the center of attention, okay? So it's there's an enormous need to, hey, what about this? What about this? Wow, tease you and blah, blah, blah. And then you go histrionic narcissist, which then gets you into Hollywood, okay? So histrionic is like, hey, what can I do to show you all of my particular capacities and gather my one-upness and never be an influencer in relationship to stage, and then I will, whatever I can to be the center of the party. And then there's histrionic hysterical, which goes back into sort of those dependent and avoidance, which are, oh my God, this horrible thing happened and this horrible thing happened. Can you believe it? And blah, blah, blah. And a constant, on stage that there's an intense vulnerability. So that's essentially the way I would do the characterization of modern histrionic. It's an unbelievably strong attention seeking. They're pretty shallow, so they just come out with all of this potential intimacy and emotionality, and it's really basically an performative instrumental display. You try to get underneath that, and they're like, they don't know who they are because they're compensating a lot, and this is a performative kind of way to maintain connection, but it's actually their deep souls. They're very confused about what it is. So it's this shallow performative dance in a particular kind of way, and then it can go, like I said, competitive, narcissistic, or under hysterical, histrionic.
I want to pick up on a point that, I threw out a couple of ideas about classical interpretations of the hysteric, and I think it comes up in a lot of different diagnoses. There's a sense that where is the energy coming from? And maybe it's being displaced from some other area. I like the Greco-Armenian philosopher Gurdjieff, and again, this is a 1920s model. For some reason, those fascinate me. He talked about wrong work of centers, right? So in this sense,
I'm not familiar with this, but okay.
Sort of like chakras, quasi-independent subjective systems, intellectual, emotional, kinesthetic, sexual, etc., and that they all need to be exercised and educated and integrated. But before that, they have to be disentangled. So ordinarily, they're taking each other's places, kind of like an internal competition dynamic. So we run sobbing from math class because it turned out we were trying to calculate with our emotions instead of our intellect. Or people are going to church to moan and convulse and dress up for their neighbors. And you're like, okay, that's your spiritual activity, but you're treating it like it's your dating activity. So there's all these systems are getting in each other's way and parasitizing each other's functions. From a UTOK eye, is there any evidence that systems can actually steal energy from other systems, or is that just an intriguing metaphor that humans fall into a lot?
That's a really good, excellent question. I certainly definitely think that there's cyclical rhythms and energies in particular kinds of systems. I mean, look at your daily circadian rhythm. Okay, so the idea that you basically have a body system that's operating in a particular system. You wake up, you're in the middle of the day, your cortisol systems are regulating all that, go to sleep, etc. Okay. Certainly, I've recognized in my own libido systems, the systems will get all activated. It's like, oh my gosh, when I have that energy, and then all of a sudden, and I noticed that I'm now 50. It's like, it's different than I was 15. There's a different energy there. And when it was 15 and it carried all these kinds of energies, it would leak into all sorts of different kinds of, no pun intended, structures. Okay, so absolutely the energizing aspects of these then influence modes. So I would generally think about these vertical layers of body, heart, mind, ultimately spirit, okay, and the coherent integrative vertical alignment across history and relation. If that's not the case, then you're going to have certain kinds of activation that's going to create disequilibrium, and then the conflict between those kinds of things are going to be central to understanding psychic functioning. So that's at a general level, the answer is yes, in terms of at least the way I would structure the understanding of the psyche. And indeed, I like internal family systems. So, it's probably a basic variant in relationship to this, which is, I don't follow it religiously, but I definitely follow the idea that there are different modes of being that we have, sort of an inner child, we have protector modes, we have healthy kinds of modes, we clearly have a persona, we've got different kinds of things that we're kind of navigating. When the inner families all getting along, each system has a particular stage, they get validated in particular kinds of ways, they play off of each other in fun opponent ways. It's like, oh, okay, hey, I'm a professor here, and then I come home and date wife, night wife, and blah blah blah, and then your father, and these different modes are operating. When you're not really, when each mode is sort of like only getting partial its needs met, and this is what we said with borderline personality, the modes fight against one another intensely. Okay, and then if you're thinking about cyclic rhythm, you get activation, you express that, even at the level of the cell, okay, active impulse, and then it releases that, and then it returns to baseline around that. So the idea that you get charge and then release, and then that energy is dissipated through the system because it actually needed to express something in a particular way, and then that has its influence as it carries, and then when it subsides, it returns. I mean, a basic orgasm is a pretty clear example that we can do that at multiple levels. So the basic architecture of that seems very reasonable to me. The specifics, and then really understanding it in general, and then understanding it specifically, it's going to be a lot of creative, and I mean this in a positive sense, creative fiction building is like a narrative story that actually can kind of make sense, but to hold it to a high epistemological standard, like a scientific assertion, that would probably be, much more questionable.
We have today a sense of these basic traits, right? We say, oh, someone's high on neuroticism. But the old-fashioned approach was to say there's a neurotic character type, and they're similar and they're a little bit different. I think everybody sort of thinks of a character Woody Allen plays in movies, right? Or a kind of self-sabotage routine where, the person who can't get an erection because they keep worrying about whether they're going to get an erection or not.
Totally.
Right. So there's this sort of high-level cognitive loop problems where our attempt at self-adjustment keeps sabotaging the thing we're trying to adjust.
Yep.
What is neurosis from the UTOK view?
Beautiful. Well, it's something I definitely want to bring back. And you're absolutely right. And UTOK is actually very clear on this issue that there's a distinction. We want to make a very important, they did it a long time ago. Personality, should it mean your character on the one hand, we can talk about what that means, and temperament on another. Okay. And then the big five came along and it was so successful. That's the idea that there are these big five, temperamental dispositions. You can do ocean with it. That's openness, conscientiousness, agreeableness, extroversion, neuroticism. Okay. And what are these kinds of things? And so from a UTOK perspective, we want to understand that across development and say by adolescence, and certainly you could see the temperamental patterns before, but we'll say it's definitely through a behavioral genetic, but I also believe a socialization, experiential process. There's debate about this, but I would argue that this is the case. And then by adolescence, you sort of settle. Okay. So the easiest then to start was just trait neuroticism. So one of the big, what is that? Well, remember when I was saying in the body, you have your gas and your brake. Okay. Or another way of saying that is your positive and negative affect system. All right. So essentially that system can operates dispositionally at various levels of idling. So how high does your car idle? Okay. How high does your negative affect system idle? Okay. So if you're high on trait neuroticism, which by the way is probably the single biggest factor that brings people into psychotherapy, is just basic trait neuroticism there, which basically means you can look, the core of this is depression, anxiety, and general negative affect distress. Okay. Then you get vulnerabilities to shame and guilt, irritability, hostility, and then a self-conscious critical looping on top of that. These are the facets that are identified in a big five disposition. And the essential answer is because they're sitting on a very sensitive horse. It idles high so they're more annoyed than other people, so they feel self-conscious about that. When something comes in, they go up faster, they stay there longer, and it's harder to get back down. So that's the way it operates. So if you're high trait neuroticism, that's the deal. And then it's difficult to regulate. You feel self-conscious. Am I weak? Am I vulnerable, etc. And if people aren't taught how to ride that horse, they're very vulnerable to neurotic looping. And in fact, I wish that people could identify these horses early, validate, figure out a healthy, the whole model is how to healthy emotionally metabolize that. So that's trait neuroticism. Character neuroses gets back into what I was talking about, the difference between mental disorders and diseases. And that is they're entrenched maladaptive patterns, okay, whereby the ways in which people get activated and then the ways in which they respond have short-term understanding functionality and maybe historical learning functionality. But when we place this response in the context of an individual's goals, the consequence is deeply problematic, okay? So then a classic example here would be like, an alcoholic. So somebody feels self-conscious, life's not going really well. When you have a drink, the system says, and you then negatively reinforce because it takes away aversive feelings and you disappear for a little while, okay? And then if you drop into that and your system then craves that, then that escape, unfortunately, doesn't solve any of your problems, okay? But unfortunately now adds a significant liability in terms of, empty calories, in terms of damage to the liver, behavior patterns, etc. And now you have a maladaptive entrenched pattern that prevents you from reaching fulfillment, that reciprocally narrows you into a dead-end strategy that makes you feel more and more vulnerable, that only makes you invest more and more in this kind of defensive pattern, only to leave you feeling more and more unfulfilled. So the character neurosis is the maladaptive patterning activated usually by defense of negative situations, negative feelings that then trap you into maladaptive structures and sort of dysfunction relative to potential. Trait neuroticism is the disposition of negative affect as a core experiential, part of the human mental system.
I can't tell you how happy I am when people have answers to the questions I bring up.
Well, good, man. There's a few things that make me happier than making Layman happy. So this is a virtuous cycle. See, this is virtuous instead of maladaptive.
Positive addiction. We talked a little bit about depression earlier, and I want to come at it again from a slightly different angle, because I've heard from some people in organizations that do a lot of brain scans that the same sets of verbally described and behavioral symptoms can be sort of like convergent evolution. You can get the same sets of these things out of different types of causes. So when you look at the brains of depressed people, some of them might be underperforming, and some of them might be overperforming in the sense that they burn themselves out doing even trivial tasks. So how do we make sure we're looking at a category and not sort of generalizing a number of different categories that just have similar symptoms?
Totally. Well, this is and I applied UTOK to depression. In fact, this is the first construct that I really looked at through a UTOK lens. The first thing I said is that we apply this. We have to ask, well, what is it from our institutional health perspective? And then we get in this battle of, is it a disease? Is it a problematic reaction? Is it a normal reaction? And so that's a big problem. And then the UTOK, through behavioral investment theory in particular, which basically says the core of behavior is work effort relative to return on investment. Okay. And then if you expend work effort and you can't get return on investment, then the idea that you would restrict the desired expenditure and shut the system down makes very good sense. So that we would have this potential, like Seligman's dogs, when he locked them in and shocks the thing, he induces a particular, what he calls learned helplessness, but you could just call a shutdown system. The system collapses. When they put rats in pools, they swim all along. And then how long do they get to they basically sort of freeze because they can't swim any longer. And so they just try to then float. And actually antidepressants on rats are successful when they swim more and more, even though from a perspective, okay, you can't say you'll never get out, but if you swim more and more, the antidepressant is seen as a success. It's like, but from a behavioral investment perspective, I don't know that that's right at all. Okay. So that's an interest. And by the way, in Seligman's dogs, 1/3 of them would never get depressed. So the low neuroticism, high extroverted people are and that's true as dogs too, that those systems will generally be resistant to shutting down. And there'd be pros and cons in what's called a frequency distribution of these kinds of behavioral types of strategies, I would guess, as to why we see this distribution still in virtually all mammals and certainly in humans. So then we basically say, okay, we need to understand then that the depression is a category. It's a low well-being category by definition that's then defined by the system shifting. If we're talking about a dispositional structure of depression, then it's going to be high negative affect, low extroversion. And if you have this as your sort of two trait dispositions, you'll carry a low-grade depression with you. That's the nature of it. Okay. And that's going to should, from a unified theory perspective, look in the body structure differently than somebody whose, wife left them and they're completely crushed. And then that will be a slightly different picture. We want to then understand what's operative in the shutdown. We understand what the structure of the individual is. We want to then understand what's the history and then this trigger in relationship to it and how they're kind of adjusting. So that's, to me, and that gives rise to the idea that depressions may be normal reactions to significant losses that need to actually be held and metabolized. And then the shutdown is congruent with this and makes perfect sense. The depressive disorder, which is very understandable, but not necessarily a shutdown. And then there are depressive diseases. Certainly you can get vascular strokes, essentially, especially in the left hemisphere, which is more positive affect, leaves you a little bit more negative. So that would be like, yeah, there's actually literally malfunctions there. And I actually believe in what's called melancholic depression. There are states where that shutdown gets so fundamentally pervasive, the entire system is just dysfunctional. I mean, it's just in a sick, dysfunctional state. To try to respond to a melancholic person in a melancholic depression, like a quote normal person, that's ridiculous. Okay. So what I would then bring is a fine-grained analysis of this process of shutdown through these particular kinds of lenses, and then explore the processes of which the categories, and then utilize that to hypothesize around what kind of brain activity would we expect in which regions, what would be over kind of brain activity and under. So there will be a certain kind of dopaminergic drive system that's almost certainly going to come down. Okay, there will be a self-conscious, threat-based system that would, like, I'm going to be defeated, it's going to be ineffective, especially people with shame-based depressions. That's going to prefrontal cortex, that's going to perhaps get on a real cycle, because what is that doing? It's justifying, don't take responsibility, don't take action, there's no point, you're a loser, submit quickly. So it just will get into a loop to keep that system justified and shut down.
Talking about depression makes me think of manic depression, and there's a part of my brain that easily goes to a cynical place with this, like, oh, you're manic depressive, like you're happier sometimes and not so happy other times. What a unique problem you have. But there are a number of these double-headed diagnoses, right?
Sure.
There's manic depressive, there's bipolar. What do you make of these sort of bidirectional diagnostics?
Right. Well, I mean, the old term of manic depression then became bipolar, and then there's these different shades of them. So, in fact, the lowest shade is what's called cyclothymia. Cyclothymia is basically moodiness, okay, where you really basically do seem, more than most people. You have good times and euthymic times, and you drop into negative times, but you don't meet any of the real criteria for then bipolar 2. Bipolar 2 is like you have hypomanic episodes with depression. Remember, I said mania then goes into hypomanic, manic 1, manic 2, manic, then just complete, then breakdown. So bipolar 2 is you have clear hypomanic episodes, but no mania episodes. So you get this fluctuation kind of dynamic. And then classic bipolar 1 is when you have any evidence of a full manic episode. So then there's just scriptures about what constitutes a hypomanic versus manic episode. So to me, our complex adaptive system has all sorts of different processes that are constantly in opponent process. You mentioned the parasympathetic, sympathetic nervous system. Neurons themselves, active, activators and inhibitors at its foundational ground. And it's the first. Freud is studying this in crabs and lobsters, and look, the whole fucking system. It's like, that's where everybody gets the whole kind of like drive defense thing as an activation. So things that are engaged in ideally a healthy opponent process, the influence matrix, power and love, how do you navigate that? Autonomy and dependency, how do you navigate that? You do that healthy, okay? So how do you navigate positive and negative affect? How do you approach things that are good and holding these issues in? To me, one of the most important ideas about coherent, integrative, healthy is when the two opponent processes work together and synergistically complement each other. So you basically get maximum flexible functionality. Sometimes, however, they pull against each other in very, very strong ways. And then they fight deeply against one another. So I love you one minute and then I hate you the next. That's unbelievably radical. Like I really like you, but here you annoy me sometimes. Can we work this out? That's different, okay? So, but with certainly then you get in, basically what I see in a lot of individuals is, there are lots of reasons to believe that body system will cycle between gas and in a way that's confusing, okay? And people can track that and see that in their body. I wonder about, there are lots of reasons why you would basically have somebody be a little moody dispositionally. You can wonder what's happening in them historically. How do they relate to these particular kinds of feelings? If you have a naive identity, okay, who's vulnerable to what my mentor would call black and white thinking, feelings are thoughts, etc. It's very easy to see how you can get people splitting on these kinds of issues, whereby as things go and you rose-colored glasses on, then all of a sudden you get all excited and you justify that, and then you're creating images and expectations, and that's very, very optimistic and hopeful. The flip side with pessimism, okay? And you can watch yourself. It's very clear that we do this. I get up, if I have a really good morning and everything else, I look at the horizon of the whole globe, and sometimes I see heaven and sometimes I see hell. My mood basically is like, my unified theory is going to take off. We're all going to knit together a new Metamodern game desynthesis, and we'll find our way to wisdom, and woohoo. And other times like, oh my fucking God, we're screwed. We're never gonna, this is we're fleas on a Titanic and we're absolutely doomed. Okay. And so why the world isn't all that different, but they'll project onto it, and then I'll image it, and then I'll justify it. And that's a particular kind of loop. So if we agree that it's a looping process, now, thankfully, I'm at a place where I can I attend to that. I understand that. I don't get committed to that in a particular way. I have an observing stream in relationship to that, knows that I will cycle in and out. I'm fine with cycling a little bit through because it gives me these different flavors. I see them as really useful. I think it's very important to see the world as potentially heaven and hell. But if I had these two modes of being that I saw as fundamentally different, that pulled me in radically different ways, that hated each other, well, then you have a whole different kind of structure.
Panic attacks. I've been watching The Sopranos lately, and which is great because the mob boss is going for therapy about his panic attacks. I've had maybe 2 or 3 incidents where I'm like, maybe that was a panic attack. I'm not sure. And some of them, it seemed like my system was trying to warn me not to do the thing I was just doing. Sometimes I thought, well, for all I know, it's a physiological thing that something went wrong inside, and panic is how you should feel.
Totally.
And then on somehow related to that is anxiety disorders. Right? Social anxiety, normal social anxiety. I don't think people think of me as having much social anxiety, but very often the people who seem relaxed nonetheless are super sensitive to it. They're constantly trying to negotiate there around the anxiety, and so they look kind of smooth. What's your general impression of anxiety disorders versus normal anxiety? What's normal anxiety?
Totally. So I mentioned before, and right now we're going through an anxiety epidemic. So we are absolutely, we used to be sort of depression, now anxiety, and in our children, by the way, the mental health epidemic is seen most clearly in the rise in anxiety. Okay. So anxiety, whereby sort of you have fear in the base, anxiety is a more cognitive disorder, conditioned, felt sense. You could see this in the sense fear normally has a direct stimuli. Anxiety then goes into a felt sense of potential vulnerability. You're channeling through modeling threat and potential bad outcomes that you're trying to anticipate, and you're running through various kinds of elements. You don't necessarily, when you see the stimulus, you'll drop into fear. It's an anticipation of vulnerability, expectation of problematic outcomes that you're trying to work through, model, and anticipate and avoid. So that's the general sort of difference, but it's clearly a line of fear into anxiety that then basically is taking the deliberative and justificatory narratives and guiding them through possible threat functions. Okay. So it's totally normal. I mean, you go your first day of class as a professor or a student or doing anything, you're first day in the psychotherapy office, you wander into a new setting and everything's kind of a surprise. If you're feeling any reason why this would be threatening or vulnerable, the idea that you're creating images and narrative about why that would be the case is totally normative. I can give you a story of somebody's unbelievably low trait neuroticism and low anxiety and how all the fucking problems they had in their life, okay? Because they were also low conscientiousness and did unbelievably crazy, reckless things and didn't care, and ended up in jail and all sorts of other problems in their lives, okay? So we need this to be able to be sensitive to potential threats. Of course, if it gets out of control and you crack into the classic neurotic looping of a sense of threat, and I justify, oh my God, this is a real problem, and then you get more anxious in relationship to that, you get feedback loops on it. And then generalized anxiety is essentially some felt sense of some negative emotion, a secondary anxious that's usually sort of defending against it that then loops a justifying sense. So you're constantly vulnerable, and then you're constantly in this active aroused threat state where under all or most conditions, it has to actually be for 6 months to get a generalized anxiety disorder diagnosis. When we get into this issue of panic attacks and panic disorder versus, and then most people have what are called anxiety attacks. So let's differentiate. An anxiety attack is an acute system where you get stressed about something, okay, that you're stressed about, and it captures you and it engages in basically a form of cognitive hijacking, whereby it becomes on the stage, you're totally overwhelmed by it, you justify why it is, and then you can't contain it, and then you secondarily hate the feelings that you're having, and you can't believe, and then all of a sudden you essentially are overwhelmed and decompensate. So you're weeping uncontrollably, totally terrified, can't think, blah, 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 can go on for hours, okay? That's what I would, and I think that, I haven't followed DSM-5 nearly as much, but basically anxiety attacks I think are listed in DSM-5. And so it's a clear trigger, you get overwhelmed, you're already feeling vulnerable, your exhausted coping resources are, the stressor accesses them, and the weight of it, causes the system to decompensate, and you're just ashamed and out of control, etc. Okay, so that's an anxiety attack. What's a panic? So the argument basically is that we do have a fundamental sense that an alarm system can go off in our body, that it's a fundamental sense of threat of death, craziness, and insanity. Okay, a classic panic disorder, and it's triggered by a panic attack, which is conceptualized by, so there's going to be a physiological deviation from normal, okay, that signals a possibility of something very dangerous and bizarre happening, that then gets identified by the narrative reflective system as, oh my God, what is that? What the hell, what is that in my heart? Okay. And then the anxious attention on the physiological symptom then just spreads into the body, where the body then feels the anxiety as if it was looking at a bear. Now is looking at the physiological system as a potential indicator of threat. Well, it's essentially a physiological phobia then. So if you have a phobia of the anxiety, that then triggers more indications that this is going to be a disaster, either that I'm going to have a heart attack, I'm going to go crazy, I'm going to go insane, I'm going to then have all of these bad things happen to me. So essentially, it's a phobic response to a physiological fluctuation that then gets reinterpreted as indication of death, or usually. And so, and what you basically see in a classic panic disorder, person be going along, they're at the, at the grocery store or whatever, and then they're standing in line, then all of a sudden, huh? And then they feel shallow in their breath and a little flutter in their heart or whatever. And then they have the thought of, oh my God, am I having a heart attack? What is this? They get in the car, it's like, and they're just completely caught off guard. There's no, because they were just at a grocery store that they're often in, there's no stimuli in relationship to it. So the only attribution is that my body is going through something very unusual and very weird. So they almost always end up, if a full-fledged panic attack into then gets a diagnosis of panic disorder the first time, you should end up in the ER if it's a real panic disorder, because basically what's happened is you convince yourself that this is a signal that your body's about ready to collapse or you're about ready to go insane, and it feels completely out of the blue. So you run over, to an emergency room. That makes perfect sense. And then they do diagnostics on you, and then they're like, actually, you're clean. And so it must have been this kind of loop. And then there are good reasons to then bring what would be like a cognitive behavioral view on a classic panic disorder that sees this as an opportunity to reinterpret the phobia of the physiology. So they blend together definitely, but the classic panic disorder is essentially out of the blue, generally triggered by some physiological phobia. Anxiety attacks are, you see what the stimulus is, you want to be able to cope with it, all of a sudden you can't, and then you decompensate, and that will last generally a lot longer. And usually you don't go to the ER for it. I didn't know. Actually, I will also say, so then there's also social anxiety and social phobia. Okay. I mean, these are generally equivalent terms. The modern term social anxiety. So individuals with social anxiety relates, by the way, to avoidant personality disorder. But it's basically individuals that experience social contact, and they can do it sort of generalized. Any new environment then is seen as a potential threat where people are going to criticize me, and that's going to be embarrassing. I'm going to be defeated. I'm going to be irritable in relationship to that, what I will contain. It's super threatening. Classically, social anxiety then finds itself in particular settings. The most obvious is any kind of public display. So the idea that then the light of attention will be shined on you and you will engage in an embarrassing act and be completely shamed by it. People get overwhelmed by that capacity, and that's, get public speaking. But social phobia is often undiagnosed. People miss it. They miss it for generalized anxiety. It's really something I teach my students, basically. You want to be able to differentiate and hone in on sort of classic social anxiety, social phobia thing.
Subtle energy. If you describe subtle energy work to somebody who's maybe high trait neurotic, they might worry that you're a psychic vampire because you're concerned that you're feeling into and being nourished by the vibratory allure of other people. But it always seemed to me, in terms of spiritual practice, that when you're doing it consciously, it's usually beneficial for everyone involved. And where I've personally experienced a draining effect that I might call psychic vampirism is around someone who I might describe as narcissistic.
Yep.
Right, which is sometimes grandiose, but not always grandiose, right? Sometimes you're dealing with a seemingly very nice person talking about very nice things, but they're sealed in an airless loop of self-justified personal experience that is just soul-crushing even to hear about.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Yeah. And to some degree, you know, from the spiritual perspective, there's widespread low-level narcissism just by having a human egoic psyche. When is narcissism a diagnostic problem? When is it clinical narcissism?
You know, that's certainly a good question with all these issues. You know, where do we draw the line? And it's a very, very complicated, and I don't think it receives enough, you know, what's clinically significant. That's it. And it's basically this judgment line. And much of it is like, well, do you have problems or not? And with something like narcissism, it's very complicated. You know, like I got into a debate with Alan Francis a little bit online and a few other people about what's a diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder. Okay, like for example, the real argument that Trump shouldn't have the diagnosis, which you could argue, but at the same time, as I pointed out, if Trump came into any setting after, say, he lost the election, was like, oh my gosh, I'm reflecting, I'm not happy with my life, I'm wondering where I am, and became dissatisfied, we would definitely give him a narcissistic personality disorder. So that's interesting, isn't it? Right? It's like, as long as he's fine and completely defended and keep doing Trump algorithm, it's debatable. But if he then got insight from a psychodynamic perspective, felt some, you know, shame or self-consciousness, which he wasn't really capable of before, as he does that, he now meets criteria because he's in distress for it. Right? So these are, you know, that's interesting. From a psychodynamic perspective, I would say that that's moving in a healthy direction. There's actually a possibility. Of course, that gets into the whole values about what is human functionality. I mean, Trump looks at me as like, who the fuck are you? I'm goddamn president. You know, it's like, well, it's complicated, you know. So certainly egocentrism is a pretty ubiquitous developmental dynamic. You know, kids are, you know, and we're all definitely vulnerable to seeing the world through our own lives. One of the biggest skills we have to consistently practice. Even, by the way, for people who are other-centered, they're often very self-absorbed. They're constantly thinking about how other people will see them, and they're trying to attend to others, but it's through their own needs to be protected and to be belonging. So, well, you know, we carry a particular perspective on the world, ours. That's what we see, because we get the sense that we're sort of on stage and that everything, you know, so often, and I'm very vulnerable. This happened, and then did everybody see me and what it was that, you know, I didn't? And everyone's like, no one's ever paying attention to you. And I was like, you were on your own stage. So you get egocentric kind of tendencies, which are natural and inevitable. Then individuals get sort of self-absorbed and critical, and they feel vulnerable, and then they're just flooded with that kind of focus. And then a lot of it, just on a developmental line, the capacity and the narcissistic sort of personality dimension is like, hey, you get the message that your ego needs to justify why you're important, superior, and better than everybody else. And we all, especially our society, sort of cultivates aspects of this. They want to kind of create this. People then, for a whole host of different reasons, would then get, you know, more and more. Where is the line with regards to its dysfunction? There is no, that's a judgment call that requires societal values. It requires clinical judgment, requires levels of distress. It's generally made just sort of conventionally. Hey, if you're here and you have problems, we have an issue. I did a blog on Steve Jobs on this issue also. Was his narcissism justified? In the sense that he was a pretty narcissistic guy, could be very controlling, yet he was unbelievably a genius, you know, and he transformed the world. And this dynamic about what should we tolerate in somebody who's so unbelievably capable in certain regards, and yet you talk to his daughter, and you know she's paid a serious price for some of those dynamics.
Does it matter if it's justified? Like, that's an interesting question, you know, because they're like, I don't know, what do they say? You know, you're not paranoid if they really are out to get you, but
yeah.
Are you still paranoid if it's justified? Like, when does justification undermine the diagnosis? When does the justification operate independently of that? You're still messed up, even if it's justified.
Totally. Well, this is, I mean, I think that's a great question. And the answer, I don't have an answer for that. I think that has to be contextual. I don't think that there is a great answer, you know. So for example, I mean, sometimes I'll do it this way. So you're on the train to Auschwitz and you're like really happy, like woohoo. And it's like, that's fucked up. If you're miserable and scared and brutalized and about ready to, your family gonna die. I mean, what we would want to see, would say, hey, did you hear? Last night my whole family was killed in a car accident. But oh well, I'm here for the podcast.
How do you diagnose a depressive or a neurotic on the train to Auschwitz?
right. Depressive reactions. That's the context. So to me, the red line, the red circle, the seventh branch is the well-being, and the outer circle is your worldview, ideology, and values, which then basically has to inform what is optimal, normative functioning, which we absolutely, you just need to own. Part of that's going to be constructed. You can develop decent justifications for certain things. Part of it's going to reflect a particular value structure, So me, I'm kind of like a egoic psychodynamic rationalist. It's sort of like, okay, I have some notions in relationship to how people might live, blah, blah, blah. If you're an unbelievably creative shamanistic artist, there's going to be different kinds of things that you're going to value in relationship to this. If you're Jordan Peterson depressive, and oh my God, the challenge of life and the need to pull the Sisyphus rock back up to the hill and clean your room and live that life in a particular way, then that feeds into his architecture, and he's going to be much more sort of sympathetic to some of that stuff, or more like that gives life meaning. For me, it's sort of like, that's a lot of suffering, maybe unnecessary. So we're all going to have conversations, societal and individual conversations, and it's an iterative process about where we want to put what's responsible for it. We just reviewed the movie Ordinary People. I don't know if you ever saw that movie, 1980 movie. It's a great movie, in my opinion. And in terms of, it's a great movie for psychopathology. It tells the story about upper middle class family in Chicago. The two sons, they go out. It's a horrible storm. The boat tips over. The older son dies, and then it picks up the story with the younger son having all sorts of anxiety, PTSD, depression, makes a suicide attempt, and then he ultimately finds therapy and he grows. But you watch it and you say, well, where is the psychopathology in the family? Okay, like what's justified? And of course, at a checklist, he's made a suicide attempt. He's clearly depressed. He clearly has PTSD. And we have all of our DSM diagnosis. But the movie shows the family, and the picture that it basically shows is how we try to conventionally say what's okay, and the mother then plays a particular figure, basically regulating her persona in a hyper conscientious, sort of obsessive compulsive sort of way, where it's like, oh my God, we just need to perform in a societally approved way. You see her mother, and you regulate and control all the animalistic and heart impulses that make us primates, and you just try to erase all that stuff from mother's perspective. The message of the movie is, oh my God, we actually need to connect to our heart and body. When we do, we can afford a coherent, existentially real life experience. But what you then see is, as he does that, then the mother and the whole family sort of decompensates in a particular way. So then we ask, well, where is the what's justified? Was his injury, a injurious expression, really justified based on the family and societal dynamics? That's part of the message of the film. Is like, fuck, man, we really do a lot of ego repression, and we need to get back in touch with the soul and get in touch with our emotional selves. Ian McGilchrist's been making this case very prominently now. And I believe that, but this issue about, well, was it justified that he felt really alien, and this is in some ways, and he was suffering. So you have to kind of get in this, well, yeah, what is societal? What is the system? What kind of is optimal functioning? How can we talk about values that we can, really believe in and move towards and make ethical decisions around? And, it's messy and complicated shit.
In past discussions, we've talked about my sense of the transition phase from sentient to sapient creatures, right? And this sort of general idea of a mirror phase, cognitive capacity to make a map of the individual body as a neurophysiological operating system that gives us self-awareness as a unit apart from the environment and the species, and also an increased self-coordination and self-tinkering affordance.
Beautiful.
But that self-mapping is not based on comprehensive objective information about our body. We form it out of Frankenstein fragments of true and false self and other experience. So we get people who suffer body dysmorphia, a mismatch between their map of the body and their actual body. We also get gender dysmorphia, where we have a mismatch between the genetic or genital situation and the feeling of identity in the individual.
Sure.
Are these in the same category? Are they fundamentally different? What's up with dysmorphias?
Ah. Yeah, I think they're, well, this is a complicated issue. Way to walk me into this one. Okay. So body dysmorphia to me basically is going to be kind of a combination of low self-esteem, self-consciousness, and probably an obsessive glitching, okay, combo. So basically, hey, I feel vulnerable. I need, there's what's going on. And then all of a sudden you have a distortion around a particular feature that you obsessively ruminate around, and then channel a lot of your, the reason my world is bad is because of this, and then create, essentially a loop around that. I'm guessing that there would be some, quirky perceptual dynamics in relationship to that associated with an anxious, sense of insecure attachment and vulnerability, and then defensive justificatory dynamics that basically allow the explanation for all my problems through this kind of thing, and there's a redirection. Okay. It's possible and indeed probable that certain cases of, dealing with, say, trans conditions would really manifest that. And when you get into that, the reason this is really tricky is then you're like, well, now what we're really seeing is an identity that is not able to cohere and integrate, hunting for rationalistic defensive justifications, and then channeling that into a particular way where then the felt sense of dysmorphia is really a manifestation of not being in touch with the self in a particular way, or having defenses, psychodynamic defenses. I think there's some truth to that. It's also a complicated claim to make. The reason then that I would say I believe there's a pretty classic architectural understanding of trans experience in what would be called sort of a classic trans type. Okay. So, and I make this point, is like when you take a UTOK perspective, people always think biology versus, nature, nurture, biology versus society. We have sex and gender, all of these two categories. From a UTOK perspective, these two categories have just totally missed the boat in terms of the schematics we want to do. We want to understand ourselves as biological organisms at the level of life, okay? We understand ourselves as mental animals at the level of mind. That's a totally different level, okay? And then you have a culture justificatory person structure. So it's 3 levels, not 2, okay? That set the stage for our development. If you use the 3-metal model, then at the level of, and believe, which certainly like I do, and I make the argument, that the mental structure, okay, then comes online differently than the genital structure, but essentially through the development of the primate. You can then argue that there are archetypal masculine and feminine structures in our nature that orient us towards dispositional ways of being in the world that are felt as feminine and felt as masculine, prior to the gendered constructed roles that justify one or the other. If you agree with that, then you can actually have a clear archetypal pattern of what a trans individual might experience. And I've talked to individuals that this resonates for. So you would have the genetic structure, say an XY chromosome that gives rise to a male body. And then as the neurological architecture is developing, you get a neurohormonal structure that then creates the brain-based architecture in a much more archetypally feminine way. We can talk about what that would mean, but there are lots of different reasons to believe that there are socio-emotional feminine primate tendencies. Just look at the primate kingdom, okay? And then that individual again gets born into a society that has justificatory structures, identifies at this time he as a male, and then as she gets socialized into a place where they start to be able to reflect, they identify very strongly with the feminine energy, as it were, and then recognize that their psychic structure is out of whack with both the biophysiology and the socialized gender roles that they've been given, and then realize that they actually need to shift the gender justification to be in line with the feminine, and then perhaps get surgery or whatever to bring their biological structure in line. So in that case, what you basically would have is, yes, you'd have a misalignment that would explain then the body gender dysphoria that would then afford the capacity to transition to then afford alignment, which would then afford much more coherent integrative structuring through the various layers of the living organism, the mental animal, and the justifying person.
Yeah, this is a complex overlapping area, and it's also sort of, it's one thing to feel you're different than society's stereotypes of your gender. It's another thing to feel you're different than your physical body's layout. There's some similarities and some differences. And in that last case, obviously, socially, people are very divided in how to address a person who feels differently than the physical layout of their body. Should they psychologically learn to accept their body as it is? Or should they be free to modify their body to fit their sense of who they are? And which one's going to afford them the most potential for alignment and growth? But the very principle of coming across situations where there are options diagnostically is interesting. It sort of leads into, sometimes people talk about postmodern therapies, which are a little bit like, you have choices. You're almost like the client. You're a customer. You're coming in and you want to purchase a particular effect and you want it to be done fairly quickly. Right. NLP and hypnotherapy and cognitive re-scripting. I want change X, Y, or Z. And it's a bit like cosmetic surgery where it could be a necessary skin graft, but maybe you just never liked the tilt of your nose and it's nobody's business that you want that change. So, what's your sense of what pathology means when it comes to voluntary options for changing ourselves and the sense of patient as customer who wants to be cognitively or behaviorally modified from something that they're treating as a pathology, whether it is or it isn't?
Totally. So let's just, we'll go modern and then postmodern and then metamodern. Okay. So the modern, modernist idea is that science figures out a way to decipher what is empirically true, does empirical validation, and then the experts know the categories of nature that afford them realization of what's actually going on. So you, as the patient, client, whatever, certainly not a customer, you go to the expert, you get the label, they tell you what it is because they have studied the set of categories and decided and figured out the essential features of nature so they can say, oh, yes, you are this. Okay. And that then affords with when I say modernity, it's the idea that, oh, we figured out reason, and then through reason, we can figure out truth. And now we have truth systems that correspond to reality in an essentialist way. And then we can be confident in those and apply them. Okay. It's simplistic, but that's basically a modernity kind of a set of assertions. Then you get postmodern kind of coming along. From a UTOK perspective, essentially the postmodern lens is all of those claims are embedded in a system of justification, where you have investment and influence dynamics that are actually playing a huge role, power dynamic about what's getting legitimized, what's getting normatized, what is possible. And essentially we live in an unbelievably flexible, imminent narrative perspective whereby we decide to build stories about what the hell's going on. And those stories certainly have consequences, but the stories in relationship to essential reality, that is, some absolute independent, verifiable thing, independent of the way we talk about the world, it's constituted by the language games that we play. Ergo, if you come in and think I have all these problems, it's like, yeah, we will grant you whatever problem you want. What's your disorder of the day and what fits your narrative and what then is most empowering for you in relationship to this, because it's all fluid in terms of what is real relative to its contextually, socially constructed justifications. And we just want to do it in a way. It's really just sort of this pragmatic, quasi-nihilistic kind of structure. It's like, well, we're going to pick the one that minimizes suffering, gives you the most empowerment, and there it is. Okay. And, as in an integral, post-integral UTOK fashion, metamodern fashion, we say, well, they're both partially true, right? It absolutely is the case, as far as I'm concerned, that scientifically we know we're primates, okay? And we can say by primates, we're going to care about a lot of things, like the whole architecture, like of, say, the influence matrix. We didn't come around and invent that. When my daughter wrote a little story and then dreamed that she would be the next Twilight author at 12, the idea that she would produce something and then wish for other people to want it, it wasn't because we told her, oh, it's good when other people like your work. You learned that and we constructed that. We could have told her that you wanted to be homeless and be rejected. No, the influence matrix architecture of the system is part of our fundamental natures. We didn't construct that. I believe there are masculine and feminine tendencies in the world that certainly are greatly influenced by the role systems and justifications, but they exist prior. I mean, only 50,000 years ago, we were inventing these. UTOK says, hey, there's massive dynamics of justification. And then there's the TOK angle that situates it into a more natural science perspective. So what I would basically say is a lot of what we do is creative fictions, okay, in our world. A lot of what we do are build quasi-useful justifications that are not well thought of as correspondent theory of truth, but more useful pragmatic stories we tell ourselves. That's the postmodern frame. That's a very important frame to have. But to say that that is foundational and that's only what it is, and that we can reduce knowledge to the philosophy of language and social construction is grossly misleading and dangerous. That needs to be tied to some other kinds of tethered to other kinds of realities. And so I often talk about us as primates and persons. The persons is the socially constructed justificatory narrative. We want to make sure we realize that those systems of justification are very flexible. A lot of them are quasi-delusional fictions that we sort of live through. We want to be able to get adjacent to them. That's what I see a metamodern, kind of like, oh, you're this, I'm that, okay, cool, whatever. We can switch at some level, but not as that's the whole picture. We also need to recognize that, okay, we are primates. There are certain kinds of constraints that are placed on it. We better get our natures somewhat right, or else the alienation between our narrative and our experience is going to be so dramatic, we have serious problems. So we have to get that relationship right. I don't think the modernists or the postmodernists quite get it right. Maybe the metamodernists will.
There's a whole set of places I'd like to go in, that begins with relativity of diagnosis and then moves into transnormal pathologies, both the things that can go wrong in transnormal, breakdown versus breakthrough, but also the ways in which advanced forms of being can retroactively make normal human activity pathological, and where that might be justified and where that might be unjustified. I'm aware we've been at this for 2 hours. I have another person I need to talk to in 10 or 15 minutes. So what if we call this part 1? And then we do another one of sort of more advanced upper end diagnostics.
Beautiful. Any justification to talk to you, Layman? That's a good one.
And I think this is great because I think a lot of fans of you and fans of UTOK want to hear some more in-depth specifics around diagnostics. And I think, a lot of people, this is what I can, when am I going to have the UTOK DSM and hold it in my hand? I think there's a real possibility there for some kind of knowledge set that's super useful to people.
And so what you're getting from me is where I was, 10, 15, all of this 10, 15 years ago. And I really think this is important advances. The issue also is that sort of like, we also need to think societally, you need to think about wisdom, we need to think about what we fundamentally value, and then create these dialectics between, what is a coherent, integrated, pluralistic society that has core values that serve as a lodestar, afford ethical decision-making, grants the multiplicity of pluralities, and at the same time can also afford us a lens that understands what psychopathology is, psychiatric pathology in particular kinds of ways, and that's definitely part of the project. So I appreciate the opportunity to kind of come back to my clinical psych days when I've been meta-psych wisdom energy recently, and share this kind of perspective, because this to me is what, if we're going to have this sort of like sacred, natural kind of blend of spirituality, quasi-theology, applied meta-psychology, etc., these are the conversations we need to have. So I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, that's great. Now we can bank on all this stuff, and we can look at the supernormal leading edge of what pathology means next time.
Beautiful. All righty, friend. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, we'll set that up. Always a pleasure, Gregg.
Absolutely. All right. Take care.